I stood in the doorway of his penthouse office, watching as both their faces drained of color. My wife, Sarah, elegantly perched on the edge of his mahogany desk, and James Anderson, the supposed billionaire who had stolen her away, frozen mid-conversation. The look of sheer panic in their eyes wasn't from being caught. No, it was from the stack of documents I'd just placed on the desk. Ownership papers, board certificates, controlling shares, all bearing my name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Impossible, James whispered, his manicured hands trembling as he reached for the papers. This company, it's mine. I built this. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Did you? My gaze shifted to Sarah, whose perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide her growing horror. Or did you just think you did? Looking at them now, I couldn't help but remember how it all started. 3 months ago, I was Marcus Chen, the quiet force behind ACG Holdings, one of the largest private equity firms in the city. I had spent years building my empire in silence, preferring to operate from the shadows while others played the public face of success. James Anderson was one of those faces. Charismatic, polished, the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he walked into a room. I had handpicked him 5 years ago to be the public CEO of my most prestigious acquisition. He was good at his job, I'll give him that. Good at making people believe he was the brilliant mind behind the company's success. Good at convincing everyone, including my wife, that he was the owner of a billion-dollar empire. Sarah and I had been married for 12 years. We met before any of this success, back when I was still building my first company. She stood by me through the late nights, the missed dinners, the years of uncertainty, or so I thought. What I didn't realize was that while I was crafting my empire, from behind the scenes, she was growing tired of living in the shadows. I first noticed the changes at our anniversary dinner 2 months ago. The way she barely touched her food, how her eyes kept drifting to her phone, the slight tremor in her hand when she mentioned running into James at a charity gala. I should have seen it then, but I was too consumed with closing a major acquisition. In Europe, the signs kept piling up. Late-night work meetings, new designer clothes, a sudden interest in attending corporate events she'd always avoided before. I didn't want to believe it at first. Didn't want to acknowledge that the woman who had promised to stand beside me through everything was slipping away. Then came the letter. I found it on our bedroom dresser one evening, her wedding ring placed carefully on top. The words were cruel in their simplicity. I'm leaving with James. He can give me the life you never could. The spotlight, the recognition, the excitement. Don't try to find us. She didn't know. How could she? I'd spent years cultivating my privacy, letting others take the public credit while I pulled the strings from behind the scenes. James Anderson, the man she thought was her ticket to a more exciting life, was nothing more than an employee, a well-paid actor in a play I had directed. I sat in our empty bedroom that night, reading the letter over and over, feeling something shift inside me. Not just grief, not just anger, but a cold, calculating purpose. Sarah had left me for a man she thought owned a billion-dollar empire. She had no idea that the quiet husband she'd abandoned was actually the one holding all the cards. Standing in that penthouse office now, watching their world crumble with each document they reviewed, I felt no satisfaction. Only a deep, resonating certainty that some betrayals demand more than just acceptance. They demand revelation. The board meeting starts in 20 minutes, I said, checking my watch. I think it's time we discussed some changes in management, don't you? The look on James's face, the dawning realization that his carefully constructed world was about to shatter, told me everything I needed to know. The real story was just beginning. My phone buzzed at exactly 9:37 p.m. that evening, Sarah's. name flashing across the screen. I let it ring, imagining her pacing in some luxury hotel room, her world suddenly spinning out of control. 15 missed calls from James had preceded hers. The executive who had played the role of billionaire CEO so convincingly was now discovering what it meant to be truly powerless. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown apartment, watching the city lights flicker beneath me. The board meeting had gone exactly as planned. The look on James's face when I walked in, not as the silent investor he'd occasionally seen in quarterly meetings, but as the controlling owner of ACG Holdings, was something I'd remember for a long time. The other board members hadn't been surprised. They'd known all along who really owned the company, who made the real decisions. They'd simply played along with the charade because it suited our purposes. James Anderson, with his perfect smile and manufactured charisma, had been the ideal frontman, until he'd made the mistake of believing his own lies. My phone buzzed again. A text from Sarah this time. "We need to talk. Please." I took another sip of whiskey, letting the amber liquid burn down my throat as I thought back to how this all began. The signs had been there, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. Sarah had started attending more social events, always, gravitating toward the spotlight she thought I could never provide. She'd become obsessed with appearances, with being seen at the right places, with cultivating the image of success. Then came the charity gala 3 months ago. I watched from the shadows as she laughed at James's jokes, touched his arm, looked at him with that sparkle in her eyes I used to see directed at me. I could have stepped in then, revealed everything, but something held me back. Perhaps I wanted to see how far it would go, or maybe I needed to understand just how deeply the betrayal would cut. The affair had been calculated on James's part. I was certain of that now. He must have thought Sarah was his ticket to real ownership, that sleeping with the quiet investor's wife somehow gave him leverage. The irony would have been amusing if it hadn't been so painful. My security team had tracked their every move over the past month. Private dinners at exclusive restaurants, secret meetings at upscale hotels, whispered phone calls when they thought no one was listening. Each betrayal had been documented, filed away, waiting for the perfect moment. Another text from Sarah. "Marcus, you don't understand. It wasn't what you think." I laughed quietly to myself. What I understood was that my wife of 12 years had fallen for an illusion. She'd chosen a carefully constructed facade over the real thing. She'd written that letter, left her ring, walked away from our life together, all for a man who was nothing more than an employee in my company. The board meeting had been brief but devastating. I had calmly presented evidence of James's misconduct, his abuse of company resources, his attempts to take credit for decisions he had no part in making. The board, of course, had voted unanimously to remove him. His company car, credit cards, and access to all corporate properties were revoked before he'd even left the building. My phone rang again. James this time. I could almost hear his desperate plea before I even answered. How quickly the mighty fall when their pedestals turn out to be built on sand. I walked to my home office, unlocking the safe behind an abstract painting. Inside lay another stack of documents, evidence of every decision James had made, thinking he had real authority, every dollar he'd spent trying to impress my wife, every lie he'd told, thinking he would never be caught. Sarah's perfume still lingered in our bedroom. Designer dresses still hung in the closet, price tags attached, bought with money she thought belonged to her lover. The ultimate irony was that everything she'd been chasing, everything she thought James could give her, had been within her reach all along. The city continued to sparkle below, indifferent to the drama unfolding in its midst. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tomorrow, The business world would wake up to news of James Anderson's spectacular fall from grace. Sarah would realize she'd left her husband, who quietly controlled billions, for a man who now controlled nothing. But this wasn't the end. No, this was merely the beginning of their education in consequences. Because while James was about to learn what it meant to lose everything, Sarah was about to discover that some choices can't be undone with a simple apology. My phone buzzed one final time. A text from my lawyer: "Everything is in place for tomorrow." I smiled, finishing my whiskey. The real revelations were yet to come. The first time I met James Anderson, he was nothing more than an ambitious regional manager at a mid-tier investment firm. That was 6 years ago, before I transformed him into the polished illusion that would eventually seduce my wife. I remember that initial interview in vivid detail. Him sitting across from me in a suit that was trying too hard to look expensive. His rehearsed answers. His carefully crafted persona of success. What had caught my attention wasn't his experience or his credentials. It was his ability to make people believe. He could sell a story, paint a picture of prosperity that others desperately wanted to buy into. In short, he was the perfect front man for what I needed, someone who could be the public face of success while I maintained my privacy and control. I leaned back in my office chair now, scrolling through old photos on my phone. There was one from 3 years ago, a corporate event where James was giving a keynote speech. Sarah was there too, standing in the background, looking somewhat bored. Back then, she had zero interest in the corporate world. She was focused on her photography, spending weeks at a time traveling for shoots, perfectly content with our life together. Or so I thought. The transformation had been gradual. I noticed Sarah starting to attend more corporate events about a year ago. At first, she said she wanted to support me, to understand my world better. I should have seen it for what it was. In the beginning of her discontent, her growing attraction to the spotlight, she thought I could never provide. Another photo caught my eye. Sarah and James at the Thompson Foundation Gala 4 months ago. I hadn't attended as usual, preferring to make my donations anonymously. The picture showed them dancing, nothing inappropriate on the surface, but I could see it now. The way she looked at him, the slight lean of her body toward his, the sparkle in her eyes that I hadn't seen directed at me in months. My assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Chen, the financial reports you requested are ready." I pressed the button to respond. "Send them in." The documents told the story I already knew. Every expense James had charged to the company while wooing my wife. 5-star restaurants, private jet trips, luxury hotel suites. He'd been living large on my dime, thinking his position as CEO gave him the right. The irony was almost poetic. A message popped up on my phone. Another desperate plea from Sarah. "Marcus, please, we need to talk about this. You don't understand how things happened." I did understand, though. I understood perfectly. Sarah had fallen for the same illusion everyone else did. The charismatic billionaire CEO, the self-made success story, the man who seemed to have everything. She hadn't known she was leaving the real source of that power for its mere reflection. My mind drifted back to the early days of our marriage. We'd met at a small coffee shop where she was working while building her photography portfolio. I was already successful then, but still maintaining my privacy, still letting others be the face of my companies. She'd loved that about me, my dedication to the work itself rather than the recognition it brought. "I love that you're different," she'd said once, curled up beside me on our old apartment's balcony. "That you care more about building something meaningful than getting credit for it. Things change, people change." The Sarah who had loved my quiet strength had somehow transformed into someone who craved the very thing she once dismissed. The spotlight, the public acclaim, the superficial trappings of success. My phone buzzed again. A message from my head. Of security, Mrs. Chen and Mr. Anderson have checked into the Four Seasons, separate rooms. I smiled slightly. Their perfect world was already cracking. The board meeting had stripped James of his CEO position, his company access, his carefully constructed image of power. Now, he was just another unemployed executive with a resume stained by scandal. Opening my laptop, I pulled up the draft of tomorrow's press release. The business world would wake up to the news that James Anderson, the supposed billionaire CEO, had been nothing more than an employee, a well-paid actor in a play written and directed by others. The financial papers would have a field day with it, but that wasn't enough. Not for what they'd done. I opened my safe, pulling out another file, one containing evidence of every shortcut James had taken, every regulation he'd bent, every ethical line he'd crossed while playing his role. He'd gotten sloppy in recent months, too confident in his perceived untouchability. Those mistakes were about to cost him everything. The sun was setting over the city skyline, casting long shadows across my office. In less than 24 hours, James Anderson's reputation would be in tatters. The man Sarah had chosen over me would be revealed as a fraud, a puppet whose strings I had always controlled. But that was just the beginning. Because while James was about to learn the price of betrayal, Sarah needed to understand that some choices have consequences that can't be undone with a simple apology. My phone buzzed one final time, an email from my lawyer confirming tomorrow's board meeting agenda. Everything was in place. The real story was about to begin. The following morning, I watched from my office as the news broke across every major financial network. The headlines were exactly as devastating as I'd planned. ACG Holdings CEO James Anderson removed amid scandal. Billionaire CEO revealed as employee. The fall of James Anderson. Corporate deception rocks financial world. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Journalists, industry analysts, board members, everyone wanted a statement, an explanation, an inside scoop on how one of the most prominent figures in the business world had been revealed as nothing more than an elaborate facade. I let them wait. The silence would only fuel the speculation, make the revelation even more impactful when the full story finally emerged. Sarah had tried calling 17 times since midnight. Each voicemail more desperate than the last. The most recent one played through my car's speakers as I drove to the office. "Marcus, please. I know I made a terrible mistake, but you have to let me explain. James, he told me so many things. He made me believe... God, I was such a fool. Please, just call me back, please." I pulled into my reserved parking space, the one that had always been empty until now, as I usually preferred to park in the public garage to maintain my anonymity. But today was different. Today, everyone needed to know exactly who I was. The lobby fell silent as I walked through. Employees who had only ever seen me in passing, who had assumed I was just another investor, now looked at me with a mixture of awe and fear. They had all witnessed James playing the role of the powerful CEO, commanding attention, taking credit for decisions I had made from the shadows. Now they knew the truth. My executive assistant, Linda, met me at the elevator. She had been one of the few who had always known my true role. "The press is going crazy," she said, falling into step beside me. "And Mr. Anderson's lawyer has been calling non-stop." "Let them wait," I replied, entering my corner office, the one James had used for public meetings while I worked from a smaller private office on a different floor. "What about the other matter?" Linda handed me a tablet. "The audit team finished their preliminary review. It's worse than we thought." I scrolled through the report, a grim satisfaction settling in my chest. James hadn't just used company resources to seduce my wife. He'd been playing fast and loose with corporate funds for years. Small discrepancies, nothing obvious enough to raise immediate alarms, but when added together, they painted a picture of systematic abuse of power. "Have you seen this morning's stock reports?" Linda asked. I nodded. ACG Holdings stock had actually risen on the news of James's removal. The market, it seemed, appreciated transparency, even if it came in the form of a scandal. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. "Marcus, please. James is falling apart. He's talking about leaving the country. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know any of this. Can we please just talk?" I deleted the message without responding. Let them both stew in their panic for a while longer. Let them feel the ground crumbling beneath their feet, just as I had felt when I found Sarah's farewell letter. The morning crawled by in a blur of meetings and phone calls. Board members expressing their continued support, major clients reaffirming their confidence in the company, reporters trying to dig deeper into the story. Through it all, I maintained the same calm demeanor that had helped me build my empire from the shadows. Around noon, my security team reported that James had checked out of the Four Seasons, destination unknown. Sarah remained in her room, having ordered nothing but coffee and making dozens of phone calls. She was probably trying to reach our mutual friends, seeking support, explanations, any lifeline she could grab onto. I opened my laptop, pulling up the surveillance photos from the past 3 months. James and Sarah at expensive restaurants, at private clubs, at exclusive events. Each image had been carefully documented, time-stamped, filed away for this exact moment. Not because I needed proof of their affair. That didn't matter anymore. What mattered was showing Sarah exactly what she had thrown away our marriage for. A man who had been living a borrowed life, spending borrowed money, projecting borrowed power. Linda appeared in my doorway again. "The Wall Street Journal is running a special report tonight. They want to know if you'll comment." I considered it for a moment. "Set up the interview, but make it clear I'll only discuss the business aspects. The personal details are off limits." She nodded, understanding perfectly. The business world didn't need to know about the personal betrayal behind James's downfall. Let them focus on the corporate scandal, the abuse of power, the web of deception. The rest, the broken marriage, the shattered trust, the intimate betrayal, that would remain private, at least for now. My phone buzzed one final time. A text from an unknown number. "You've destroyed everything. I hope you're happy." James, probably using a burner phone. I saved the number without responding. Every desperate message, every angry threat would only add to the evidence pile my lawyers were building. Looking out over the city skyline, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a cold certainty that justice was being served. James had played at being a billionaire with my money, had stolen my wife with a borrowed lifestyle, had built his reputation on my success. Now he would learn what it meant to lose everything, just as I had when I found Sarah's letter on our bedroom dresser. But this was just the beginning, because while James was watching his fake empire crumble, Sarah was about to learn that some betrayals can never be undone, no matter how sincere the apology. The real revelations were still to come. The media storm that followed was relentless. By late afternoon, my PR team had counted over 300 news articles, each one dissecting James Anderson's spectacular fall from grace. The financial world was reeling, not just from the revelation that one of its most prominent CEOs had been a carefully crafted illusion, but from the emerging details of his misconduct. I sat in my private conference room, watching the coverage on multiple screens. CNBC was running a special segment titled "Smoke and Mirrors, the James Anderson Deception." Bloomberg had analysts discussing the implications for corporate transparency. The Wall Street Journal had somehow dug up photos of James from before. I hired him, a stark contrast to the polished figure he'd become under my direction. My phone lit up with a text from my head of security. "Mrs. Chen has left the Four Seasons. En route to your primary residence. Of course she was. Sarah had always been strategic. Even in her desperation, she knew I wouldn't be at the penthouse. I hadn't slept there since finding her letter, but she probably hoped to find something, anything, that might give her leverage in the chaos that was unfolding. "Have someone meet her there," I texted back. "Politely escort her off the property." The irony wasn't lost on me. Just 3 months ago, Sarah had been the one denying me access to our home, claiming she needed space to think, while she secretly planned her exit with James. Now she was the one being turned away. Her keycards deactivated, her security clearance revoked. Linda appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. "The audit team has finished their comprehensive review." She hesitated, which was unusual for her. "Sir, there's something you should see." The report she handed me made my blood run cold. James hadn't just been embezzling funds for his affair with Sarah. He'd been systematically siphoning money into offshore accounts for months, preparing for something bigger. The amounts were significant, not enough to damage the company, but enough to set himself up comfortably if he managed to flee the country. "He was planning to run," I said, more to myself than Linda. "Probably wanted to convince Sarah to go with him." Linda nodded. "The transfers started right around the time their affair began. Should I alert the authorities?" I considered it for a moment. Going to the police would make everything public record. The affair, the betrayal, every sordid detail splashed across the headlines. Part of me wanted that, wanted the world to know exactly what kind of people James and Sarah were. But another part, the strategist who had built an empire from the shadows, knew there were better ways to handle this. "Not yet," I replied. "Let's see how this plays out." My phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. "They won't let me into my own home. My cards are all declined. Marcus, you can't do this. We need to talk." I almost laughed. She still didn't get it. Everything she thought was hers, the penthouse, the credit cards, the lifestyle she'd become so accustomed to, had always been mine. She had just been too blinded by James's borrowed glamour to see it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city as I stood by the window, remembering another sunset from what felt like a lifetime ago. Sarah and I had been celebrating our 10th anniversary, watching the same sun set from our balcony. She had looked at me with such warmth then, such genuine love. "I don't need all this," she had said, gesturing at the luxury around us. "I just need you." What had changed? When had the quiet contentment of our life together become insufficient? When had she started craving the spotlight so desperately that she was willing to throw away 12 years of marriage for a man who turned out to be nothing but smoke and mirrors? My security team reported that James had been spotted at a private airfield outside the city. Predictable. He was probably trying to flee before the full extent of his financial misconduct came to light. But I had already frozen his accounts, alerted border control, made sure every escape route was blocked. Linda returned with more updates. The board had issued a formal statement distancing themselves from James. Major clients were calling to reaffirm their commitment to ACG Holdings. The stock price had stabilized, even begun to climb, as investors realized the company was in stronger hands than ever. "Sir," Linda said hesitantly, "Ms. Thompson from the Chronicle is still waiting for your statement. She's asking about the personal angle, wants to know how you discovered the deception." I shook my head. Let them speculate. The business world didn't need to know how I had sat in our darkened bedroom, reading Sarah's farewell letter over and over, feeling my world collapse even as I began planning its reconstruction. My phone lit, up with another text. This time from James's burner phone. "You've made your point. Name your price. Everyone has one." That was James, still thinking everything could be bought, still not understanding that some betrayals go beyond money. He had spent years playing the role of a billionaire, but he had never understood the true nature of power. As the day drew to a close, I received one final message. An email from my lawyer confirming that all the pieces were in place for tomorrow. James's financial misconduct would be exposed, his reputation destroyed, his future in the business world effectively ended. Sarah would watch the man she chose over me revealed as not just a fraud, but a thief. But that wasn't enough. Not for what they had done. Because while James was about to learn that some mistakes can't be fixed with money, Sarah needed to understand that some choices have consequences that last a lifetime. The real reckoning was still to come. The next morning, everything changed. I had arranged for the evidence of James's financial misconduct to be released to select media outlets at precisely 9 a.m. By 9:15, the story had exploded. This wasn't just about a CEO who had pretended to own a company. This was about systematic fraud, embezzlement, and criminal misuse of corporate funds. I watched from my office as the new headlines rolled in. Former ACG Holdings CEO James Anderson accused of multi-million-dollar fraud. Criminal investigation looms as financial misconduct revealed. The fall of James Anderson from fake billionaire to alleged criminal. Sarah's desperate messages had stopped. Instead, I received a single email from her at 10:23 a.m. I don't even know who he is anymore. Who either of you are. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. She had left me for an illusion, a carefully constructed facade of wealth and power. Now that facade had crumbled, revealing not just the lie she had fallen for, but an even darker truth beneath it. My security team reported that James had made 3 attempts to leave the country in the past 12 hours. Each time, he'd been turned away, his passport flagged, his access to private aircraft denied. He was trapped, watching his borrowed world collapse around him, finally understanding that all his charm and confidence couldn't save him from what was coming. Linda appeared in my office, her expression grave. "Sir, the FBI is here." I nodded, right on schedule. The federal investigation had been inevitable once the extent of James's financial crimes came to light. What he didn't know was that I had been building this case for months, documenting every illegal transfer, every misappropriated fund, every falsified report. The 2 agents were professional, direct. They had questions about James's activities, about the company's oversight procedures, about when we had first noticed discrepancies. I gave them exactly what they needed, no more, no less. The evidence spoke for itself. "Mr. Chen," one agent said as they were leaving, "given the scale of this fraud, we're surprised it wasn't caught earlier." I met his gaze steadily. Sometimes, people only see what they want to see. By early afternoon, the story had taken another turn. Financial analysts had begun digging into James's past, uncovering a pattern of deception that stretched back years before I had hired him. Failed businesses, burned investors, a trail of broken promises hidden beneath a veneer of charm and confidence. My phone buzzed, a message from Sarah. "They're saying he might go to prison. Marcus, please, I didn't know any of this. You have to believe me." I let the message sit unanswered. She had chosen to believe in James's illusion, had thrown away our marriage for a man who turned out to be not just a fraud, but a criminal. Her ignorance didn't absolve her of responsibility. The board called an emergency meeting at 3 p.m. They were nervous, concerned about the company's reputation, worried about shareholder reaction. I let them talk, voice their fears, before calmly explaining how this situation would actually strengthen ACG Holdings in the long run. Transparency, accountability, decisive action. These were things the market respected. As I drove home that evening, I passed the restaurant where Sarah and James had first been photographed together by my security team. The memory of those surveillance photos, their intimate dinners, their secret meetings, their stolen moments, no longer held any power to hurt me. Instead, they had become evidence, pieces of a puzzle that was now complete. My phone lit. up with another message from James's burner phone. "You planned this, all of it. You knew what I was doing and you let me hang myself." He wasn't wrong. I had watched him dig his own grave, had given him enough rope to ensure his fall would be spectacular and complete. Every criminal act he committed, every dollar he stole, every lie he told. I had documented it all, waiting for the perfect moment to bring everything crashing down. Linda called as I was entering my apartment. "Sir, Mrs. Chen's lawyer has requested a meeting. They're proposing a settlement." "No meetings," I replied. "No settlements, not yet." Sarah needed to understand that she couldn't negotiate her way out of this situation. She had made her choice, had believed in James's illusion so completely that she had thrown away 12 years of marriage. Now she would watch as that illusion was stripped away, layer by layer, revealing the ugly truth beneath. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across my living room. I poured myself a whiskey, remembering another sunset, another time when Sarah had looked at me with love instead of desperation. We had built a life together, had shared dreams and plans. For the future, she had thrown it all away for a man who had turned out to be nothing but a criminal in an expensive suit. But this wasn't the end. The criminal investigation was just beginning. James would face justice for his financial crimes, would watch his carefully constructed world crumble completely. And Sarah would learn that some choices have consequences that no amount of regret can erase. My phone buzzed one final time. A message from my lawyer confirming tomorrow's proceedings. Everything was in place. The real devastation was yet to come. The morning the criminal charges were officially filed against James Anderson, I sat in my office watching the world he had built crumble into dust. The U.S. Attorney's Office had moved faster than even I had anticipated, the evidence I had accumulated proving too compelling to ignore. The charges were devastating: wire fraud, money laundering, embezzlement, each count carrying potential years in federal prison. Sarah's latest voicemail played through my office speakers, her voice cracking with a desperation I had never heard before. "Marcus, they're saying he could face 20 years. This can't be happening. Please, you have to help him. If not for him, then for me. For what we once had." I deleted the message without a second thought. The irony of her begging me to help the man she had left me for wasn't lost on me. But she still didn't understand. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about justice. My security team reported that federal agents had arrested James at his temporary apartment early that morning. The image of him being led away in handcuffs, his designer suit wrinkled, his carefully maintained facade finally shattered, had already made its way onto every major news network. Linda appeared in my doorway, holding a stack of newspapers. "The coverage is extensive," she said, laying them on my desk. Each headline was more damning than the last. Tech CEO facing decades in prison, $1 million fraud scheme exposed, from penthouse to prison, the James Anderson story. But it was the Wall Street Journal's headline that caught my eye. "Behind the facade, the real owner of ACG Holdings emerges." They had done their homework, digging into my background, uncovering the truth about how I had built my empire from the shadows while letting others take the spotlight. My phone buzzed. A message from one of the board members. "The shareholders are calling for a public statement. They want reassurance." I typed a quick response. Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning. It was time to step fully into the light, to let the world see exactly who had been pulling the strings all along. Sarah would be watching, of course. She would finally understand the magnitude of her mistake, not just in betraying our marriage, but in choosing an illusion over reality. The afternoon brought a flood of calls from journalists, all wanting the inside story. How had I discovered James's crimes? Why had I allowed him to maintain the facade of ownership for so long? What had prompted me to finally expose the truth? None of them knew about Sarah, about finding her letter, about watching through surveillance cameras as she fell for the very illusion I had created. That part of the story would remain private, at least for now. My security team forwarded another report. Sarah had been seen meeting with high-powered divorce attorneys. She was finally accepting that there was no going back, no way to undo what she had done. But she was about to learn that divorcing me would be far more complicated than she imagined. "Sir," Linda interrupted my thoughts, "there's something else you should see." She handed me a tablet displaying email correspondence between James and several offshore banks. He had been planning his exit strategy for months, setting up accounts under false names, preparing for a life on the run. The timestamps on some of the emails coincided exactly with his early meetings with Sarah. He was using her, I said aloud, though I had known this all along. She was just part of his escape plan, Linda nodded. Should we tell her? I considered it for a moment. Sarah needed to understand the full extent of her mistake, needed to know that the man she had chosen over me had seen her as nothing more than a pawn in his game. But that revelation would come in its own time. My phone lit up with another message, this time from James's lawyer. "My client is willing to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency." I forwarded the message to the federal prosecutors without response. Let James try to bargain his way out of this. The evidence I had gathered was too comprehensive, too damning. His cooperation wouldn't change anything. As the day wore on, the full impact of James's arrest began to ripple through the financial world. ACG Holdings stock had initially dipped, but was now rising steadily as investors realized that the company was in stronger hands than ever. My hands. Sarah's final message came just before sunset. "I saw your name in the Wall Street Journal. All this time, you were the one behind everything. I never knew. How could I not have known?" I stood by my office window, watching the city lights begin to twinkle in the gathering dusk. She was right. She had never known the true extent of my power, had never understood that the quiet husband she had dismissed was actually the puppet master controlling the very man she had left me for. But tomorrow, at the press conference, everyone would know. I would step out of the shadows, reveal myself as the true owner of ACG Holdings, the architect of both James's rise and his spectacular fall. Sarah would watch from wherever she was hiding, finally understanding the magnitude of her mistake. My phone buzzed one last time, my lawyer confirming the final details for tomorrow. Everything was in place. The real revelation was about to begin. Standing behind the podium the next morning, I could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on me. The press conference room was packed. Journalists, financial analysts, industry leaders, all eager to finally see the man who had orchestrated one of the most spectacular revelations in corporate history. The television cameras were rolling as I began my statement. For years, ACG Holdings has operated under a carefully maintained structure of public and private leadership. Today, that structure changes. I am Marcus Chen, the founder and controlling owner of ACG Holdings, and it's time for the truth to be known. I could almost feel Sarah watching from somewhere, probably glued to her TV screen, like everyone else in the financial world. The cameras caught every detail, my perfectly tailored suit, my calm demeanor, the quiet authority that had always been there, but that I had chosen to keep hidden until now. The recent events involving former CEO James Anderson have necessitated this disclosure, I continued, my voice steady and measured. While the criminal investigation is ongoing, I want to assure our shareholders, clients, and employees that ACG Holdings remains stronger than ever. The questions came rapid fire after my statement. Why had I remained in the shadows for so long? What had prompted the decision to expose James Anderson's crimes? How had the deception been maintained for so many years? I answered each question with calculated precision, revealing enough to satisfy their curiosity while keeping the personal aspects of the story private. None of them needed to know about Sarah, about the betrayal that had set this all in motion. My phone vibrated in my pocket, probably another desperate message from Sarah. She was watching her world collapse in real time, understanding too late that she had left the real source of power for its pale imitation. As the press conference continued, I could see the realization dawning on many faces in the room. Some of them had dealt with James personally, had believed in his carefully constructed image of success. Now they were seeing the true architect of ACG Holdings' power, and the revelation was clearly stunning. Linda managed to slip me a note during a brief pause. "Mrs. Chen's lawyer has filed for an emergency hearing. They're claiming you orchestrated this whole situation to deny her fair division of assets." I almost smiled. Sarah still didn't understand. Everything she thought was part of our marital assets, the properties, the investments, the lifestyle she had grown so accustomed to, had always been carefully separated from our marriage. She had signed the paperwork herself years ago, too trusting or too disinterested to read the fine print. "Mr. Chen," one reporter called out, "there are rumors that James Anderson was planning to take control of the company through other means. Can you comment on that?" I met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Anderson's criminal activities speak for themselves. The extent of his deception will become clear as the federal investigation proceeds." What I didn't say was that James had been planning something far more insidious than a simple corporate takeover. The evidence we had uncovered showed his true intentions: to use Sarah's status as my wife to gain leverage, to threaten exposure of our private life if I didn't transfer real control to him. Another message buzzed through, this time from James's lawyer. "My client is willing to make a full statement about his relationship with Mrs. Chen in exchange for your support with the prosecutors." I deleted it without response. Let him try to bargain. The federal prosecutors had enough evidence to put him away for decades. His relationship with Sarah was irrelevant now. As the press conference wound down, I could feel a shift in the room's energy. The story they had come for, the mysterious owner of ACG Holdings stepping into the light, had transformed into something else. They were witnessing the emergence of a new power player, someone who had built an empire from the shadows and chosen this moment to reveal himself. My security team reported that Sarah had been seen entering her lawyer's office shortly after the press conference began. She was probably already strategizing, trying to find some way to salvage something from the wreckage of her choices. Back in my office, Linda had arranged the afternoon papers on my desk. The headlines were already changing. "Shadow Billionaire emerges. The real power behind ACG Holdings. Marcus Chen, the quiet titan of Wall Street. Behind the curtain, how one man built a business empire in secret." My phone lit up with another message from Sarah. "I understand now. All those years I thought I knew you. I had no idea who you really were." That was the heart of it, wasn't it? She had never truly known me, had never understood that my preference for privacy wasn't weakness, but strategy. She had fallen for James's public display of power without realizing she was already married to the man who controlled everything from the shadows. The sun was setting over the city as I finished my last meeting of the day. Tomorrow, the federal prosecutors would announce additional charges against James. His hopes of a plea deal would evaporate as the full extent of his crimes became public, and Sarah would finally understand that her choice to leave me for James hadn't just been a betrayal, it had been the biggest mistake of her life. My phone buzzed one final time, my lawyer confirming the next phase of our plan. The real consequences were just beginning. The federal prosecutor's office released the full indictment against James Anderson the next morning. The document ran to 78 pages, detailing a pattern of criminal behavior that stretched back further than even I had anticipated. The charges weren't just about financial fraud anymore. They had uncovered evidence of tax evasion, conspiracy, and even attempted extortion. I sat in my study, reading through the indictment line by line. James had been even more desperate than I'd realized. The prosecutors had found emails dating back months, showing his attempts to pressure other executives, to gather compromising information, to build leverage he could use to gain real control of the company. Sarah's name appeared multiple times in the document, though not as a co-conspirator. Instead, the evidence painted her as another one of James's victims, a pawn in his larger scheme to gain control of ACG Holdings. The emails between James and his overseas contacts revealed his true intentions. He had pursued her deliberately, seeing her as a potential weakness in my armor. My phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "I just read the indictment. Marcus, I swear I didn't know. Please, can we talk? I need to explain." I let the message sit unanswered, focusing instead on the financial news playing silently on my office TV. The markets had responded positively to yesterday's press conference. ACG Holdings stock had surged, and financial analysts were falling over themselves to revise their evaluations now that the company's true ownership had been revealed. Linda appeared in my doorway, her expression grave. "Sir, there's something you should see." She handed me a tablet displaying security camera footage from one of my private offices, the one James had never known about. The timestamp showed a date from 3 months ago, around the time his affair with Sarah had begun. The footage showed James in the office late at night, clearly unaware he was being recorded, methodically searching through files. He was looking, and for leverage, I said, watching his increasingly frustrated movements on the screen, something he could use against me. Linda nodded. "The IT team found traces of his attempts to access your private servers as well. He was thorough." Another message from Sarah flashed on my phone. "The lawyers say I might be called as a witness in the federal case. Marcus, please, I can't do this alone." The irony was almost painful. She had chosen to leave me alone, had decided that James's illusion of power was more appealing than our reality together. Now she was facing the consequences of that choice. My security team reported that James had been denied bail. The prosecutors had successfully argued that he was a flight risk given his previous attempts to leave the country. He would remain in federal custody until his trial, his designer suits exchanged for prison jumpsuits, his luxurious penthouse replaced by a cell. The afternoon brought a flood of new revelations. Financial journalists had begun digging into James's past, uncovering a pattern of deception that stretched back to his earliest days in business. Former associates came forward with stories of broken promises and betrayed trust. The man Sarah had left me for was being revealed as a career con artist who had finally pushed his luck too far. Linda interrupted my thoughts again. "Sir, Mrs. Chen's lawyer has made another attempt to schedule a meeting. They're becoming desperate." I could imagine why. Sarah had finally read through the prenuptial agreement she had signed so casually years ago. The document had been carefully crafted to protect not just my personal assets, but the entire corporate structure of ACG Holdings. In the event of a divorce, she would receive exactly what she had brought into the marriage, nothing more. My phone lit up with a new message, this time from James's burner phone, somehow smuggled into federal custody. "You set me up. You knew what I was doing with Sarah all along. You let me think I was in control." He wasn't wrong. I had watched his relationship with Sarah develop, had seen his clumsy attempts to gather leverage against me, had documented every illegal action and misguided scheme. I had given him enough rope to hang himself, and he had obliged spectacularly. The sun was setting over the city as I reviewed the latest reports from my legal team. The federal prosecutors were building an airtight case. James's attempts to bargain his way out of trouble had failed. The evidence was too overwhelming, his crimes too blatant to ignore. Sarah's final message of the day arrived just as I was. Preparing to leave the office, I saw the prenup details in the legal filing. All this time, you were protecting yourself. You never really trusted me, did you? I stood by my office window, watching the city lights flicker to life in the gathering dusk. She had it backwards as usual. The prenup hadn't been about trust. It had been about strategy, about maintaining the careful separation between my public and private lives that had allowed me to build my empire from the shadows. My phone buzzed one last time, a notification from my lawyer about tomorrow's proceedings. The federal prosecutors were planning to reveal even more evidence, to add new charges to James's already substantial indictment. The real devastation was still to come, and Sarah would watch it all unfold, powerless to stop it, finally understanding the true cost of her choices. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension the next morning as I made my way through the crowd of reporters. Today was James Anderson's preliminary hearing, and the media circus had reached a fever pitch. Every major news outlet had sent representatives, all eager to witness the next chapter in what they were calling the deception of the decade. I took my seat in the courtroom, deliberately choosing a position where both James and Sarah would have to see me. She had arrived early, sitting alone in the back row, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. The designer, clothes and perfect makeup couldn't hide the toll the past weeks had taken on her. James was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands and feet shackled. The man who had once commanded boardrooms with his presence now shuffled in like any other criminal. His eyes met mine briefly, and I saw something there I had never seen before: fear. The proceedings began with the prosecutor outlining new evidence they had uncovered. Emails, bank transfers, recorded conversations, each piece adding another layer to the picture of James's criminal enterprise. But it was the revelation about his true intentions with Sarah that caught everyone's attention. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, her voice clear and confident, "we have evidence that Mr. Anderson specifically targeted Mrs. Chen as part of a larger scheme to gain control of ACG Holdings. These emails detail his plan to use their relationship as leverage against Mr. Chen." I watched Sarah's face as the truth was laid bare. The color drained from her cheeks as the prosecutor read excerpts from James's private correspondence. "Once she leaves him, we'll have the leverage we need. Chen's weakness is his privacy. She's the key to everything." My phone vibrated silently, Linda sending updates about the company's stock performance. The market was responding positively to each new revelation, as if every detail of James's crimes only reinforced investor confidence in my leadership. The defense attorney tried to paint James as a victim of circumstance, suggesting that the pressure of maintaining his public image had led to poor decisions. It was a weak argument, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern of deception too deliberate. During a brief recess, Sarah attempted to approach me. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." I held up my hand, stopping her. "Save it for your testimony," I replied coldly, watching as tears formed in her eyes. "I'm sure the prosecutors will be very interested in everything you have to say." Back in the courtroom, the prosecution revealed their masterstroke: recordings from James's private meetings with potential co-conspirators, discussing how he planned to use Sarah to force a transfer of corporate control. The dates of these meetings coincided perfectly with the beginning of their affair. "He played you," I heard someone whisper to Sarah. "He played you like a fiddle." The afternoon session brought more damaging revelations. The prosecutors had traced James's criminal activities back years before he joined ACG Holdings. He had been running similar schemes throughout his career, always staying one step ahead of discovery, always finding new victims to manipulate. My security team reported that Sarah had left the courtroom during one particularly damning piece of evidence. They found her in the bathroom, physically ill from the revelations about the man she had thrown away our marriage for. James's lawyer made one last desperate attempt to secure bail, arguing that his client needed to be free to prepare his defense. The judge's response was swift and decisive. Given the scope of Mr. Anderson's deceptions and his previous attempts to flee the country, bail is denied. As the day drew to a close, I received a message from my lawyer. They're offering a plea deal, 25 years. Full cooperation, complete confession. I forwarded it to the federal prosecutors without comment. Let them handle it. My part in this drama was almost complete. Sarah was waiting by my car when I left the courthouse. She looked broken, defeated, nothing like the confident woman who had left me for what she thought was a better life. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "When you first discovered what he was doing, why didn't you warn me?" I looked at her for a long moment, remembering the letter she had left, the wedding ring placed so deliberately on top. "You made your choice," I said finally. "Now you get to live with it." My phone buzzed one last time as I drove home. Another update from the prosecutors. They had declined James's plea offer. The evidence was too strong, the crimes too serious. They were confident of a conviction at trial. The city lights blurred past my window as I thought about tomorrow. The newspapers would have a field day with today's revelations. Sarah would wake up to see her name splashed across the headlines, her role in James's schemes dissected and analyzed. But this wasn't about public humiliation anymore. This was about justice, about consequences, about the price of betrayal, and we were still only at the beginning. The days following James's preliminary hearing brought a torrent of new revelations. Each morning seemed to uncover another layer of his deception, another victim of his schemes, another piece of evidence that showed just how calculated his relationship with Sarah had been. I sat in my office, reviewing the latest batch of evidence my team had uncovered. James's emails to his co-conspirators painted a clear picture. Sarah hadn't just been a romantic conquest, she had been a strategic target. "Chen's wife is the perfect angle," he had written months ago. "Once she leaves him, his carefully constructed privacy will crumble. He'll have no choice but to negotiate." My phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "The prosecutors want me to testify against him. They say it will help their case. Marcus, I don't know what to do." I let out a quiet laugh. Of course, they wanted her testimony. Sarah's story was compelling. The deceived wife who had unknowingly become part of a larger criminal conspiracy. Her testimony would help seal James's fate. Linda appeared with the morning papers. The headlines were brutal. "Anderson's Web of Lies. How he used CEO's wife." In failed takeover. Love or leverage. The calculated seduction of Sarah Chen. From romance to racketeering, inside James Anderson's ultimate con. "Sir," Linda said, hesitating slightly. Mrs. Chen's lawyer called again. "They're proposing a private settlement. They want to handle this quietly, away from the media." I shook my head. "No settlements, no private arrangements. Let it all play out in public." The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah had been drawn to James partly because of his public persona, his seeming comfort in the spotlight. Now that same publicity was becoming her punishment. My security team reported that she had been spotted meeting with federal prosecutors. They had likely offered her immunity in exchange for her testimony about James's activities. She would take it, of course. Sarah had always been pragmatic about protecting herself. The afternoon brought another development. James's lawyer had made one final attempt at a plea deal, this time offering to reveal details about other corporate conspiracies he had been involved in. The prosecutors had declined. They didn't need his cooperation anymore. They had Sarah. My phone lit up with another message from her. I met with the prosecutors today. They showed me things, evidence I hadn't seen before. How long did you know? How long did you watch us before making your move? I didn't respond. Let her wonder. Let her imagine me in the shadows, documenting every secret meeting, every stolen moment, every piece of her betrayal. Let her understand that while she thought she was choosing a more exciting life, she had actually been walking into a carefully laid trap. Linda interrupted my thoughts. The board is requesting an emergency meeting. They want to discuss succession planning now that James is indisposed. I nodded. Schedule it for tomorrow. It's time they understood who really runs this company. The sun was setting as I reviewed the latest updates from my legal team. Sarah's testimony was scheduled for next week. She would have to publicly admit how James had used her, how she had unwittingly become part of his scheme to take control of ACG Holdings. My phone buzzed again. A message from one of James's former associates. You should know he had other plans for Sarah, bigger plans. If you're interested, we should talk. I saved the number without responding. Every new piece of evidence, every revelation about James's true intentions, only served to make Sarah's betrayal seem more foolish, more short-sighted. The Evening News was running another special report on the case. They had dug up footage of James and Sarah at various social events, analyzing their body language, speculating about when the affair had begun. The commentators were particularly interested in my role, the quiet husband who had watched it all unfold before orchestrating the most spectacular fall from grace in recent corporate history. Sarah's final message of the day arrived as I was preparing to leave the office. I keep thinking about that night, when I left the letter. You must have already known about James, about everything. Why did you let me go? I stood by my window, watching the city lights flicker to life. She still didn't understand. I had let her go because her betrayal had given me the perfect opportunity, not just to expose James's crimes, but to step out of the shadows on my own terms. My phone buzzed one last time, a notification that the prosecutors had scheduled a press conference for tomorrow. They would be announcing new charges against James, charges that would make his previous indictments seem minor in comparison. The real devastation was still unfolding, and Sarah would be forced to watch it all, understanding too late that she had been nothing more than a pawn in a game between two men, one who had built an empire from the shadows and one who had tried to steal it through deception. But tomorrow would bring new revelations, new consequences, new chapters in this story of betrayal and revenge, and I was far from finished. The day of Sarah's testimony arrived with an atmosphere of electric tension. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity, journalists and spectators crowding every available space. This wasn't just another day in a corporate fraud case. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, when the woman at the center of it all would finally tell her story. I chose a seat directly in her line of sight. She would have to look at me while revealing how James had manipulated her, used her, made her an unwitting participant in his schemes. Her hands trembled as she took the oath, but her voice was steady as she began to speak. I first met James Anderson at a charity gala, she started, her eyes briefly meeting mine before darting away. He was charismatic, powerful. Everything he appeared to be was a lie. For the next 2 hours, Sarah laid bare every detail of their relationship. How James had pursued her relentlessly, how he had filled her head with promises of a more exciting life, how he had subtly gathered information about me and ACG Holdings through their intimate conversations. The prosecutor was methodical, leading her through each revelation. "And when did you first realize Mr. Anderson's true intentions?" Sarah's composure finally cracked. "In this courtroom," she whispered. "When I saw the emails, when I understood that every moment, every conversation, every touch had been calculated. I was never anything more than a means to an end." I watched as the jury absorbed her testimony, saw the mix of sympathy and judgment in their eyes. Sarah wasn't just a witness anymore. She was the living proof of James's capacity for manipulation, his willingness to destroy lives for his own gain. During a brief recess, my phone lit up with messages from Linda. ACG Holdings stock was soaring. The market loved a story of justice served, of righteous revenge executed perfectly. My emergence from the shadows had transformed from a potential crisis into a testament to strategic brilliance. James sat at the defense table, his formerly immaculate appearance now haggard after months in custody. Every word of Sarah's testimony seemed to age him further, strip away another layer of his carefully constructed facade. The sentencing came 3 days later. The judge was unsparing in his condemnation. "Mr. Anderson, your crimes go beyond simple fraud. You have demonstrated a pattern of manipulation and deception that has destroyed lives, betrayed trusts, and undermined the very foundations of corporate integrity." The sentence, 30 years in federal prison, no possibility of early release. James Anderson, the man who had tried to steal my empire through deception, would spend the next 3 decades in a cell. Sarah waited for me outside the courthouse after the sentencing. She looked different now, older, wiser, the glossy veneer of the society wife completely stripped away. "It's over," she said quietly. I looked at her for a long moment. "No, Sarah, it's not over. This was just justice being served. The consequences, those are still unfolding." Her eyes widened slightly. "What do you mean?" "Check your email." As if on cue, her phone buzzed. She opened the message, her face paling. As she read, "My lawyers had filed the divorce papers. The terms were exactly as outlined in our prenuptial agreement. She would leave with nothing. No alimony, no property, no shares in ACG Holdings. Her choice to leave me for James had cost her everything." "Marcus, please," she started, but I held up my hand. "You made your choice, Sarah. You chose an illusion over reality. Now you get to live with that decision." I turned and walked away, leaving her standing on the courthouse steps, finally understanding the true cost of her betrayal. The epilogue played out exactly as I had planned. James Anderson's spectacular fall became a cautionary tale in corporate America. Business schools would study it for years to come. The story of a con man who reached too far, who thought he could outsmart the quiet power behind the throne. Sarah disappeared from the social scene entirely. Last I heard, she had moved to a small town on the West Coast, trying to rebuild some semblance of a life away from the spotlight she had once craved so desperately. And me? I remained exactly who I had always been, the man who built an empire, from the shadows, who understood that true power doesn't need to announce itself. But now the world knew too. They had seen what happened to those who mistook my silence for weakness, my privacy for vulnerability. The final message came from James, somehow smuggled out of federal prison. "You orchestrated everything, from the beginning." I never had a chance. I didn't respond. He had finally understood what Sarah had learned too late, that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should fear the most. Standing in my office that evening, watching the city lights twinkle below, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet certainty that justice had been served, that betrayal had met its natural consequence, that the story had ended exactly As it should. My phone buzzed one last time. Linda confirming tomorrow's board meeting. Life would go on, business would continue, and I would remain what I had always been. The power in the shadows, the quiet force behind the throne, the man who had turned betrayal into his greatest victory. The end wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about consequences, about the price of choosing illusion over reality. And in that I had succeeded completely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.